Hello and welcome to another episode of Linux and Code. Today we're going to be talking about part 2 of building a JSON API with Express. And we're going to be incorporating the database part of it today, and I'm going to be using Mongoose. So we're going to be doing a little bit of data modeling and configuration to get that all set up. Let's get started. Okay, so I've got my project up here, but I don't have my Docker instance running, and that's because I want to make some changes to this Docker Compose file and install some node dependencies. So first we're going to install the dependencies that we're going to be using for connecting to Mongo. And I'm going to go ahead and install that with npm. And we can see it installed successfully. Our package.json is modified to include it. Mongoose is a ORM, which is a database helper essentially, and we're going to be using it to make interacting with Mongo a little bit easier. So now that we've made that change, we're going to build another service in our Docker file to establish our database. So we're going to call that service, in this case, CoreDB, because it's the core database for the core API. We're going to use the image Mongo 4, which is the latest, and we actually don't need to add any other configuration to this service. It's good as is. We could add an environmental key for username and password for the database, but we don't actually need to do that because we're only using it in development, and it'll only be accessible inside the Docker instance. Now, if you were using this for production, which we'll get to later, you would want to override some of this stuff, but we're not going to talk about that right now. What we do need to do is add a depends on property to our core API service because it needs to have Mongo up before it starts. So we're just going to say this depends on CoreDB, save it, and I'm also going to quickly create a couple of other directories that we'll need at some point. I'm going to make a folder called routes, make a folder called middleware, and I'm going to make a folder called models, and we'll get to the models part in this. So now that I've made all of that, updated this, I'm going to run docker compose up and hit enter, and it'll create our database instance for us, and you'll see all this run through, and then it starts the API up. And now that's important because this means our API is guaranteed to start up after the database has come up already, which is important. So it looks like we're up and running, but we still don't have a database connection here in our server file, so let's get to that next. Okay, so now that we're back in our server.js file, we still need to connect the database service that's running and our API service. So we're going to include something else in addition up here. We're going to include mongoose, which is what we installed earlier with npm, and that's just a simple require. Now, we have mongoose, but it's just required right now, so we need to do a little bit of configuration. The first thing that I'm going to do is set mongoose.promise to be global.promise. And the reason for that is Mongoose has some promise functionality built in, but it's not very good. And Node.js, at least as of version 8, if not earlier, has really good promise functionality. So we're just going to override Mongoose's functionality with JavaScripts. And we're going to save that. And we're also going to come in here and actually connect our database. So mongoose.connect, and now this takes a connection string. So that's going to, at the very least, look something like Mongo, and because Mongo is the protocol that it's using, right? So it's MongoDB : / and then something. But how do we know what to reference here? We didn't give an IP address or anything. Well, in Docker, you can actually reference services by the name that you give them. So we can just say CoreDB. And that's going to map directly to our Mongo instance. And we should just be able to come in here and put the default ports in for Mongoose, which I don't remember off the top of my head, so we'll open up another Firefox window. And just grab that, drop that in, and then we need a database name, and I'm just going to call this core. Now, this obviously needs to be wrapped inside a string, but I'm actually going to have this be a fallback option. In the event that this is running somewhere else, we want to be able to overwrite it. So if we have a database URL being passed in as a property, so if we had like an MLab instance or Mongo Atlas or something, and we had a username and password and discrete URL that we were passing, we could override it here and we wouldn't even have to touch this other string. It would just be overridden by default, which is really good. So we can see actually that we get a connection because when we save this file, nodemon restarts and we get a deprecation warning about the current URL string parser, and it's going to be removed in a future version. So let's go ahead and pass in an option to use that newer connection parser. And it restarts, and we're good, and we see connection accepted. So we're good. Our database is connected. Now we can worry about doing data modeling. So let's go over to our models folder and create a new model. So I'm going to start with a user model, and I think it's just easier that way. A lot of other guides will work with creating items or notes or entries first. I like to have the user model established and then work into other items because I think it's easier to have user IDs to work with. So let's get started on that. Now, before I create this user model, I'm actually going to stop my service because I remembered I needed to install one more dependency, and that's going to be UUID. And we'll talk about that in a second when we make our models, but now I can start this up again with Docker Compose. So now that we've got that, we can get working on our models. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually import that library that we've been using, mongoose. And then also the one that I just installed, UUID. And the way we reference this is a little different. Use require, and it's UUID, but this package actually doesn't work the way you might think. So let's pop that Firefox window back open and search for npm UUID. Now, this has a lot of different features in it, but you can see the way it's referenced is a little bit different. So I'm going to use UUID v4. So we just reference this with an extra /v4. And now we can just call our UUID and we get one. But not really important at the moment. So now we're going to declare our user model. So we'll have a const user is going to equal a new mongoose schema. And this is essentially an object, but it's a special mongoose object. It has properties and things that each of the object keys will require. So the first thing that I'm going to make is a username. Again, you could name these whatever you wanted to. Username is what I'm going to use. And then we declare the type of it by default. That's the only thing you have to set. So I'm saying it is a string. Now, JavaScript in and of itself doesn't really have types for things. It's a dynamic language. This is useful because it helps us think about how we're interacting with our database, and it makes making validations for the database easier. What else might we need here? Well, preferences seems like something that we might have, but that's not going to be a string. That's not going to be an array. It's actually going to be something called a mixed because it could be several things. So we're going to do mongoose.schema types, and now we can see all of the options that we can use, and I'm just going to use mixed. Now I am going to override one thing that mongoose does by default. That's set an underscore ID. I am going to set this underscore ID to not be a object ID that Mongo uses by default. I'm going to use a UUID, and how I do that is we're going to set this to an object, and that means we can pass more than one thing. We're going to set our type. And it's still going to be a string in this case, and then we need to declare a default for it. Now this default is going to be a UUID, which means if this model gets created without anyone specifying an ID, which they shouldn't, the database should do that, it'll call this function UUID, and that will create the value for it. Now we've got that, we can actually export our user model to be usable by Mongoose, and and other node modules and other files, and we'll say module.exports is going to equal mongoose.model, and we're going to give the model a name that we want to be visible to Mongoose, and this is what it'll get set up as in our database, user. And then what are we setting that user property equal to? Well, the model that we just created, user. Now this will actually get pluralized in our database, so that you'll see the collection show up in Mongo as users instead of just user. It's just a syntax thing that it does. So we'll save that. That's all we need for now. We can actually go over and make another model. I'm going to just call this items for now, because I haven't really decided all the different things that I want to use this for, and items is a nice, or item is a nice generic term that we can kind of decide on later. So again, I'm going to, I'm actually going to copy paste some of this. I'm going to copy paste mongoose and UUID, and we're going to have another const item new mongoose schema. And again, I'm going to copy paste what we did for this ID. And I'm going to just have a item.content. Sounds useful. And this could be anything, right? So again, I'm going to use this type of mixed. And we can really use this for whatever we want at this point. But I'm also going to give it a an item type. And that's going to be a string. Now, I'm doing it this way because I want to be able to use this model for multiple things. Generally, you want to have a separate model for each of your specific data entries, and we'll get into that more later, but for right now I'm doing it this way to show how we could potentially do it in one model if we wanted to. And again, we're just going to module.exports equals mongoose.model item, again the name that it will have in the database, and the model or the schema that we're referencing for this model, which is the item that we declared up here. Before we get out of this file though, we're actually going to include one other property, and that's going to be a reference to the user that owns this item, whatever it may be. So I'm going to add a creator property on here, and it's going to be another object, and it's going to be a type string, and it is going to be a ref. That's a special mongoose property, and we're going to reference it to user. And we can save this, and now whenever we use this item, this creator property that we pass, we can pass in a normal string, which is what our user ID will be, and it kind of tells Mongoose that, hey, this is a reference to user, be aware of that. Now that we have our models established and our database connection done, we can start getting into routes, but we will do that in the next episode. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment with any feedback you might have. Hope you have a great day. Take care.